Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this EMB Third Thursday Science webinar. My name is Britt Alexander. I'm a science officer at the EMB, and I will be your moderator for today. So these are a few housekeeping rules before we get started. So make sure that your name is clearly entered on Zoom. So when you ask questions, we know who you are. And we will have 30 minutes approximately of a presentation today, followed by a question and answer session. So during this session, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And again, let us know which organization and country you're from, as well as your name. And I will select questions from the Q&A box to ask to our speaker. For any technical questions, you can use the chat box. And just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and also live streamed on our YouTube channel, where it will be available afterwards for viewing. So our speaker today is Dr. Jane Collins. She received her PhD in 2020 in biomedical sciences from KU Leuven in Belgium, and she will be speaking today in her personal capacity. So the title of her talk today is Unlocking Marine Genetic Resources, Streamlining the Legal, Policy and Business Aspects of the Marine Biodiscovery Pipeline. So this talk builds on various activities that EMB has been engaged with in the past. So we've had 2 position papers on marine biotechnology, one from 2001 and one from 2010. And then we have also a policy brief on the topic from 2017. And more recently, EMB was involved in the SOPHIE project on seas, oceans and human health, where there was an aspect of that on marine biotechnology. So there was a strategic research agenda published on that and also an EMB policy brief. So I will pass over to Jane now. Hello, Jane.
Hi. Thank you very much, Britt, and hi to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to give a presentation, and I will be focusing during this presentation on marine genetic resources and the marine biodiscovery pipeline. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides, and I'll just turn my video off just temporarily during the presentation to save on bandwidth, but I'll be turning it back on again when we get to the end and the questions. So I think that's working. I'll just put this in full screen. So my previous research and PhD project, as Britt mentioned just now, focused very much on the topic of unlocking marine genetic resources by streamlining the legal policy. Oh, sorry.
We don't see your screen.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I forgot to share my screen. There we go. That should be coming up now. Can you see it?
Yeah, that's all good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for letting me know. So my PhD was on marine genetic resources, very generally and broadly looking at the scientific as well as legal, policy and business aspects of the marine biodiscovery pipeline. But instead of giving you a really in-depth run through my academic research today, I thought it might be more interesting for a broader variety of people that may be interested in watching this presentation to actually give a more general introduction to the topic of marine genetic resources in terms of opportunities, and challenges linked to marine biodiscovery. And then I'll also give a broad overview of how the subject of marine genetic resources are considered in the context of ongoing international United Nations negotiations. So what actually are marine genetic resources and why should we care about them? If we start by thinking about the ocean and the marine environment, it's a vast area. It covers approximately 70% of the Earth's surface, and a significant percentage of life on Earth exists in the ocean. When people think about marine biodiversity, they typically tend to think about the perhaps larger, more charismatic organisms such as whales, dolphin, the huge variety of fish. But it's also really important to remember that there's a huge diversity of small and microorganisms, some of which are smaller than can even be seen by the human eye. And all of those organisms possibly or hold the potential for discovery and development of new knowledge and products. So all of those organisms, whether large, small, micro, irrespective of their size, they all contain what's known as genetic material, which can be considered very simply as the DNA. And then within that genetic material, within the DNA, there's something that we refer to as genetic resources, and that's related to the code found within the DNA. And so all of these organisms here on the screen contain marine genetic resources. Now, much of the ocean's biodiversity is still unknown and relatively underexplored, and it's estimated that approximately 90% of species in the deep sea have still not been described in any great detail. However, with rapid progress being made in the field of marine exploration technology and laboratory facilities, there's potential for the discovery of new compounds with application in various academic and industry sectors, such as possibly in the field of medicine. So there are a number of illnesses, such as cancer and chronic pain, for which no treatment or cure yet exists. And some of the lowest hanging fruits in terms of compounds from genetic resources sourced from terrestrial environments to develop medicines have already been used. So the marine environment therefore provides an interesting source of potential new compounds for scientists to explore. As you can see on this slide, there are a couple of pharmaceutical products which have already been developed using marine genetic resources from parts of the ocean within national jurisdiction, so quite close to the coast in generally shallower waters. So for example, there are 1 or 2 medicines or pharmaceutical products to treat cancer and also for chronic pain relief. And as a result of that, some people, some organizations, some stakeholders consider that there may potentially be the potential for discovery of marine genetic resources from areas of the ocean beyond national jurisdiction for the development of new pharmaceutical products. So if we think about potential pharmaceutical applications, how do we actually go from discovering a marine genetic resource to potentially developing a new pharmaceutical product? The value chain is very complicated, and it can vary depending on the type of product and type of material that's used. But on this slide, I've illustrated just a very simplified representation of the marine bioresource value chain, starting on the left-hand side with the initial stages of collecting biological samples at sea, through to discovery of new compounds with some form of therapeutic activity, and then moving on to toxicity testing, upscaling of production of desirable compounds, and finally marketing and selling of a new product. And if we look at this value chain just very broadly, we can see that activities in the early stages are very strongly tied to science and possibly also to some degree linked to business. The later stages in the value chain are very much focused on business considerations, but all stages within the value chain are affected to some degree by law. And it's this interface between science, business, and law where my personal interests lie and where I really focused a lot of my PhD research. So whilst the ocean represents an important area of opportunity, we do also have to acknowledge that there are a number of different challenges which continue to limit the collection of marine genetic resources and subsequent research and development. One important challenge is a legal challenge. And if we look at this map, we can see that ocean areas highlighted here in yellow are the areas within a state's national jurisdiction. and those ocean areas essentially belong to or fall under the sovereign right of the adjacent coastal state. But all of the area in blue is what's referred to as ocean areas beyond national jurisdiction, or ABNJ for short, and around 95% of the total ocean volume is considered as ABNJ. And the utilization of genetic resources collected from terrestrial and coastal environments within national jurisdiction, so within those yellow areas or the continents, those genetic resources and their utilization fall under laws, international laws related to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol. So without wanting to take too much of a tangent, I've illustrated here on this slide how genetic resources and a system of access and benefit sharing works under the Nagoya Protocol that currently is in force. So, for example, if a researcher is interested in a particular genetic resource in another country, let's say for this particular case that it's a country which is party to the Nagoya Protocol and has applicable access and benefit sharing measures in place, then that user, that researcher, will need to get in touch with the relevant authorities in the provided country. They need to sign a contract. First of all, they need to sign a permit, and then they need to also negotiate a contract which outlines the mutually agreed terms, which essentially means they agree on what benefits will be shared once that genetic resource has been researched and once the researcher has started to utilize that genetic resource. So once the researcher has these documents in place, they can go ahead and access that genetic resource. They can bring it back to the lab in their country and begin to research and develop that genetic resource. And then at some stage later on, benefits will, in theory, flow back to the provider country. So in a nutshell, that's how access and benefit sharing works under existing access and benefit sharing regulations. So whilst the utilization of genetic resources collected from terrestrial and coastal environments falls under laws related to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol, there's currently no law governing how genetic resources from marine areas beyond national jurisdiction, so remember that's all of the blue areas, there's no law governing how those genetic resources should be dealt with in terms of sharing benefits. And that potentially creates some legal uncertainty for researchers in industry and in academia in terms of what steps they should take. And in addition to that sort of legal challenge, there are also questions around sort of how different states can access genetic resources. So at the moment, not all states currently have the capacity or technology to physically access and collect marine genetic resources from areas beyond national jurisdiction, or to participate in the utilization once genetic resources are back on land. So some may therefore be missing out on the opportunity to derive potential benefits. And this legal challenge is currently being discussed in the context of ongoing United Nations negotiations, which I'll move on to now. So these issues, these legal challenges are being addressed at the United Nations, and the meetings are taking place at the headquarters in New York, and these negotiations are called basically called the Negotiations on Marine Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ for short. And this picture here just shows you what a typical conference room at the United Nations looks like, where some of these meetings take place. So I thought it might be helpful to give a little bit of a history to these negotiations and timeline to illustrate how this topic came about. And a good place to start really is with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short, which was ratified in 1982 and forms the basis of these current discussions. In 2004, the UN General Assembly established the ad hoc open-ended informal working group to study issues related to the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And they met for 10 times they met between 2006 and 2015. And in 2011, there was a bit of a breakthrough when a package of elements was agreed for the BBNJ process. In 2015, states adopted a resolution to develop an international legally binding instrument under UNCLOS on the conservation and sustainable use of BBNJ, and a preparatory committee, or PrepCom for short, was then established. And the PrepCom group met for, they met 4 times between 2016 and 17. And they really were working to make substantive recommendations to the General Assembly on the elements of a draft text of a potential new international binding instrument. Then on the 24th of December 2017, the General Assembly decided to convene an intergovernmental conference under the auspices of the United Nations to consider the recommendations of the PrepCom on elements that they'd recommended, and to elaborate the text for the new instrument. And then 4 IGCs or intergovernmental conferences were proposed. The first intergovernmental conference took place in September of 2018. A second conference took place in March 2019, and the third took place in August 2019. And between the second and the third, a first draft text of the potential agreement was published by the president of the negotiations, President Rina Lee, and that was released in summer of 2019. And that really helped to form some of the basis for discussions during that third intergovernmental conference. The fourth intergovernmental conference was planned to take place in March 2020, but as you can imagine, it was delayed due to the COVID pandemic, and then it took place it was able to resume in March 2022, so it took place in March this year. And then at that session, it was decided a 5th conference should be convened, and that took place last month, so in August 2022. So for anyone who might not be familiar with the BBNJ negotiations, I've highlighted here on the screen the 4 main parts of the negotiations. So there are 4 main kind of elements that are being discussed and negotiated together with cross-cutting issues. So the first, or one part which I'm particularly interested in, is the part on marine genetic resources, including questions on the sharing of benefits. But there's also a part on measures such as area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, another part on environmental impact assessments, and then another part on capacity building and transfer of marine technology. So the part about marine genetic resources, including questions on the sharing of benefits, has a number of draft articles which different state delegations negotiate during those conferences. And those articles are related to a few key points or key elements, which I've highlighted here. So the first sort of important topic that is being discussed is the definitions, the use of terms. So for example, do we need definitions for terms such as access or collection or utilization? Do we define marine genetic resources? And then how will that definition look? There's also an article on objectives of the marine genetic resources part. There's another article about application, and that considers the scope of application in terms of temporal scope and material scope. Then there are other articles which focus more on notification. So There are questions about whether and how notification of collection of marine genetic resources should be handled. Will these be notifications made to a clearinghouse mechanism, and when should they take place? With some suggestions indicating that there may be pre-collection notifications and also post-collection notifications. So that will be before and after marine genetic resources from areas beyond national jurisdiction are collected. Then there are also articles linked to benefit sharing, and that includes consideration of non-monetary and monetary benefits. Then there are also articles linked to traditional knowledge, intellectual property rights, and monitoring and transparency. So as I mentioned, the 5th conference took place in August this year, and here on the slide are a couple of images just to give you a bit of insight into what it looks like at those meetings. And during this particular conference, there were both formal plenary sessions in the main conference rooms, but there were also informal sessions where states came together to discuss particular articles, and then also some smaller working groups where states worked together to try and make progress on some of the more particularly challenging issues. So during the 5th conference, final agreement wasn't quite reached, but a lot of states and a lot of participants agreed that a huge amount of progress was reached during those 2 weeks, and actually some suggesting that more progress was made during those 2 weeks than in some of the previous sessions, which is really, really encouraging for all of us to hear. But as ever, there is a little bit more work still to be done on all of the parts. During the conference, you would quite frequently hear people saying that nothing in the agreement is agreed until everything is agreed. So although there is further work to be done on all parts, there are a couple of areas within the marine genetic resources part which may require a little bit more attention than others. And those are the parts that, in my opinion, are linked to definitions, scope of application, and benefit sharing. So on those particular elements, I think there will be further discussion on the definitions of some of the terms and whether we need definitions for those terms. There will also need to be further discussion on application, considering the temporal and material scope, and then also further discussion on benefit sharing and what exactly are the types of benefits that should be shared and when. So at the end of that 5th conference last month, it was decided that another conference will need to convene, and they've termed this one the IGC 5 bis because they believe we're very close to reaching agreement, so just an extension of the 5th conference is needed, but we're not clear totally yet when exactly that will take place. So in case anyone would like to find out more about this topic, I've listed here some publications and some websites that you're very welcome to take a look at. And I will be happy to answer any questions now that you might have. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane. That was really interesting. So I will remind the audience as well that you can put your questions to Jane in the Q&A box. Have you got your video back? There we go. Yep. So I will start off with a question from myself. So I'm wondering who are the main stakeholders in the BBNJ negotiation process and with relation to these marine genetic resources. And I'm also linked to that. I'm curious about the traditional knowledge aspect that you mentioned, given that there's not any human communities living in these areas beyond national jurisdiction. So what is considered traditional knowledge?
Yeah, sure. So I think I think there can possibly be considered to be 5 main stakeholder groups linked to marine genetic resources. We have, of course, the states that are involved in the negotiations. We have some of the active MGR user or active states that are actively using marine genetic resources, and some that are perhaps considered as emerging users of marine genetic resources. But we also have the scientific community, which is a really, really key, important stakeholder group, because they are the people that are most active in terms of going out and collecting marine genetic resources and conducting the research on them back in the labs. So it's really important to keep that stakeholder group involved and make sure that the agreement can kind of not burden, but rather work together with the scientific community. And then I think another stakeholder group would be the private sector, who may potentially be interested at some stage in marine genetic resources, and also civil society in general. I think they're another important stakeholder group. In terms of traditional knowledge, I think it's the states around the world who have indigenous communities who may be more aware than I am of what the potential traditional knowledge might be. It might be information about how to find marine genetic resources. It might be other knowledge about where marine genetic resources are, but I'm afraid I don't know more specifically about what that traditional knowledge might be.
Okay, thanks. And I've got another question related to the scientific community. So I think that you've published a couple of papers on sort of best practices for these benefit sharings, particularly related to the scientific results and the data. So the advice that you have for these best practices in relation to the areas beyond national jurisdiction, is this sort of already in line with what's already going on with the scientific community, or are there additional recommendations that you have for them?
I think probably, well, I think ensuring scientific knowledge is not hampered is a key priority. We want to ensure that we're supporting the scientific research that takes place and not add any more too much of a burden that would limit scientists' ability to conduct their research. But I think there is generally agreement that perhaps, or that we should support scientists and that we should build on existing scientific best practice. And so I think when we're looking at the draft text, I think a lot of the way that parts of it are formulated, particularly in terms of notifications, pre and post collection of marine genetic resources and sharing of information, I think that does build on international scientific best practice. So some of the things I think that scientists already do are they publish their results. I think scientists are really good at raising awareness of what their research is. They often deposit their samples in publicly accessible collections or repositories. Sometimes some of the requirements when publishing papers is also to deposit data in public accessible databases. So I think a lot of that is already being done and can be potentially further strengthened by having this international agreement as well.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so there's one more of a comment in the Q&A from Adriana Zingone about the map that you showed with the areas beyond national jurisdiction, but I think it was showing that the Mediterranean was also an AB, areas beyond national jurisdiction. Yeah. But I think that indeed that should be considered the national waters. Okay, and then I have a couple of questions. So thanks, Adriana, for the comments. So I have a question from Angel from the EMB Secretariat. He says, when the BBNJ is approved, how quickly do you expect that these new processes for the marine genetic resources will be implemented?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that there isn't any clear answer for that really at the moment, but I think it will take some time once agreement is reached for, first of all, countries, different states to ratify the international agreement, and then presumably they will also need to implement those measures linked to marine genetic resources within their national jurisdiction. So that will involve creating, I would assume, national laws about how we will enforce those regulations. So that could be assigning an enforcement authority to ensure that researchers have complied with these obligations. So, for example, if there is a requirement to submit a notification to a clearinghouse mechanism before and after collection, perhaps there will be some form of this authority that's assigned under a national law of checking with researchers. But I think that will very much depend on the different countries and how they choose to implement things at their national level.
Yeah, okay. And a question from Sheila Haymans. So she says, given that monitoring and transparency, it's not something that that you highlighted specifically in your talk. So she's wondering if that's something that's already fully covered in the draft text, and how might that be done?
Yeah, so it's not. I mean, it is another area where there still needs to be a lot more discussion. I don't think it is an area where we haven't reached agreement on that part yet. But I think the discussions on monitoring and transparency are very much linked to how can we track, for example, how do we trace a marine genetic resource from areas beyond national jurisdiction once it's collected and moves to land? How do we know where it moves to? I think there are some arguments in support of a strong traceability track and trace system. Some are suggesting perhaps using unique identifiers to know exactly where that marine genetic resource moves, so that if a product is developed and commercialized, we know that that is related to marine genetic resources which are obtained from areas beyond national jurisdiction. But the other side of the argument is that it's not totally clear to everyone how such a strong track and trace system could be implemented. Some suggest it would be incredibly burdensome and costly, and the actual practicalities of how that would be set up might be incredibly difficult. But I think the sort of general kind of discussions around monitoring and transparency is more to set up a system where we are transparent about what happens, so that maybe instead of having a track and trace system, we just encourage the sharing of information, and by making that very much encouraged and something which does happen at various stages, maybe we don't need a track and trace system, and we can instead just follow through some of the current international best scientific practice. We will be able to know where samples are and how they're utilized.
Okay, and there's one question as well from a master's student in the Q&A. I will attempt to pronounce your name, sorry if I get it wrong. It's Siddharth Dikshant Pratapchak, and he says he's interested to know how you see the exploitation of marine genetic resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So it's quite a general question. But you mentioned the pharmaceutical applications, but are there other uses of these marine genetic resources? And can you tell us a bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the key word in there is exploitation, which some people might interpret differently. I think if we're just thinking about how might marine genetic resources be used and what might they be applied for, like what sectors could they be useful for, I think we can look at how genetic resources within national jurisdiction are used to get some idea. So I think the main way that marine genetic resources will be used or exploited will be for academic research. I think scientists continue to study genetic resources to understand information, for example, about the biodiversity of species in the ocean, but then also to understand potential properties within the marine genetic resource that could be applied for different uses. If we look at genetic resources that are used linked to areas within national jurisdiction, they can be applied to a variety of different sectors. So pharmaceutical applications are one big one, which I think is the main one that people tend to think about. But you can also, or we have seen cases where genetic resources are used in the cosmetic sector for the development of cosmetic products. They could also be used for the development of food and agricultural feed products. And sometimes they can also be genetically modified and used as genetically modified organisms as well. So there are a number of different sectors, and I think biotechnology is one of the key one, which kind of bridges academic research through to a potential industry application. And it very much depends on what the scientists discover within that genetic resource and what the properties indicate that they could be useful for.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great overview. And I've got one more question as well. So you mentioned that in areas beyond national jurisdiction, this is a potentially really rich resource of new pharmaceutical compounds. So do you know to what extent there's already been bioprospecting work done in the deep sea? I know there's been some, but I'm wondering, yeah, without a BBNJ agreement, what's been done to date actually, and how has that worked so far?
Really good question. If I gave that impression, I think I might have been slightly, that wasn't quite the impression I meant to give. I think there is potential for discovery of new compounds, I think for sure, because so much of the deep ocean is very underexplored, particularly in comparison with coastal states. But the question of how much potential there is for development of pharmaceutical products, it's just totally unknown. So I think no one can claim that there is a huge potential. Arguably, you can't say the opposite either. But just looking at areas within national jurisdiction, as I think it was on maybe my third slide, there are a couple, not a huge amount. I think at the time of finishing my PhD, there were 4 marine-derived pharmaceutical products, but they were all from marine genetic resources within national jurisdiction. I think as scientists continue to explore deeper parts of the ocean, there is a possibility that they will discover more marine genetic resources with potential pharmaceutical applications because it's an underexplored area. But I don't think anyone can say yet until that research happens how likely it is. But there has been work, and I think as the costs of going out to sea hopefully reduce and technology advances so that it becomes a bit more accessible, I think that question will be addressed more and more frequently going forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in these unexplored environments, generally, yeah, because no one's been exploring them so much, so you have quite a high chance to find some novel compounds. And yeah,
possibly.
yeah.
I think it's also worth kind of thinking about the general pharmaceutical pipeline.
Yeah.
I think in general, for developing a pharmaceutical product, they sometimes start out with thousands of compounds like at the very beginning, and they're lucky if they get one compound at the end which actually is successful in all of the requirements that they need to fulfill. For example, having or displaying a therapeutic application, and also being successful in the toxicity testing and being scalable. So it's definitely a challenge, but there is potential, and I think people continue to look at that, and that is an area of great interest, I think, for everyone.
Yeah. Okay, there's another question in the Q&A, so maybe it's a bit of a tricky question, but I will ask anyway. Is there a position regarding who should bear the costs associated with the filing of marine genetic resources and associated data in a repository?
So I guess that means who should be responsible for dealing with the costs of actually depositing a sample and data in museums and collections.
Yeah.
So I think at the moment, if we have scientists going out to sea, that's often part of a university research project or a research organization, and they will likely have received funding from their government or perhaps from the EU to go out and do that research and to collect samples. So I think that's often covered by the funding associated with the scientific research project in general. But I'm not very much aware of any other positions on who should cover those costs.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So I think we will end there, and I have one more slide. So our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 20th of October. And we will have Dr. Joachim Claudette, and he will be speaking about a recent paper that he was involved with on the MPA guide, a framework to achieve global goals for the ocean. So the registration's now open for that on our website. So we hope to see you there. And I want to thank you, Jane, for joining us today and sharing your work with us. And yeah, it's been very interesting and insightful.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's been great to join you.
Yep, and thanks also to the audience for joining us today.